So we left off last time with a discussion of containment as a policy during the Cold War. And what I want to do now is just discuss this a bit more, just to make sure we have a fuller understanding of containment policy. Because as I just mentioned, containment would pretty much be the official policy that the United States would pursue as it involved themselves in foreign policy and international affairs during the Cold War era. So, containment was actually a framework to understand the Soviet Union that was actually put forth by an academic whose name was George Kennan. And he wrote this analysis of the Soviet Union and of Stalin, Stalin-led USSR. And it was so influential that it actually shaped our, as I mentioned, foreign policy approach. Okay, and it became known as containment. And even the term containment, you could kind of gather what it's about here, at least the surface level. What you want to do is contain the expansion of something. So here are some articles of faith, if you will, that are included, as well as some actual activities, right? One article of faith is the belief that socialism, in and of itself, has an innate tendency, an inherent tendency to expand on a global level. So the assumption here held by Kennan, and to be frank, most other Americans at the time, was that someone like Stalin and the USSR as empire, what they sought to do is internationalize socialism. So what should be done in that regard, right? Well, before we get to that, actually, let's get to this domino theory. The belief was that on this global scale here, after World War II, and let's remember, much of the world is war-torn. It's undergoing reconstruction, right, in most areas of the world, rebuilding their actual countries, right, infrastructure, economies. So in this context, domino theory was the belief that in this fragile state, globally speaking, if a particular country succumbs to socialism, that means all the adjacent countries surrounding that country would likely fall to communism as well. So if one country goes, that means other countries around it will likely succumb as well. Why? It's because of the inherent tendency of socialism to expand. You're going to see the exertion of influence and even perhaps military force and even invasion that's going to be undertaken by the Soviet Union, or perhaps even the People's Republic of China, in the attempt to spread socialism to those countries. And before you know it, one country, once it becomes communist or socialist, well, the other countries will fall like a row of dominoes. This is the image from where the domino theory emerged from, right? One falls, and then the whole row of countries will collapse, right? Like a row of dominoes collapsing. So the domino theory, well, it was exactly that. It was a theory. It was a belief, an article of faith, to use my earlier term, that this would happen should one country succumb to socialism. So therefore, what should the United States and our allies, what should they do to prevent the domino theory from actually manifesting itself, right? Well, the belief was, according to George Kennan again, with his containment theory, the belief was that the U.S. should exert pressure at certain geographical or geopolitical points that was believed to be areas of inevitable expansion. Okay, so for example, on this map here, if all this area, all the shaded area, were areas that already fell to socialism, Well, the belief was that any adjacent area was potentially the next domino, to use that term, that was going to succumb to socialism. So let's say here in this area with Austria right next to the area that's shaded in, the shaded in area, of course, is socialist already. What the U.S. should do is exert some kind of geopolitical pressure there, okay? Or perhaps down here by Greece, right? So that's what should be done here. And if it had to be military force, then so be it. Okay, so what you should do is, again, exert some kind of pressure there, whether just your presence there, military bases, even the use of military force, and other ways that we'll discuss soon. Well, that's how you prevent this domino theory from actualizing. All right. Now, this whole idea of containment was seen as a defensive posture. That is to say, the United States was forced to act, right? That this conflict really fell on our lap, so to speak, and we must act to prevent the globalization or the internationalization of socialism because, well, this conflict was actually couched in moral terms and even quasi-religious terms. That is to say, good versus evil. And of course, the evil, so to speak, was this guy, Stalin. And also, on the Asian part of the world, Chairman Mao. Now, what happens here during this kind of early phase of the Cold War, that's to say late 40s into the 50s? Well, the world, post-World War II, is divided into three worlds, so to speak, okay? This is what I refer to as a global taxonomy here. And I'm sure you've heard of these terms. There was the first world, the second world, and the third world. So let's make sure we're clear on what those worlds refer to. The first world refers to the United States and our allies like Great Britain. Well, you have to remember, the English Empire is collapsing and officially would collapse by the mid-1950s, okay? But let's call it Great Britain for now. France, the French Empire was collapsing similarly to the British Empire. Other countries, right? Japan, for that matter, right? That's the first world. And in terms of ideology and political economy, is to say, it is capitalist and it advocates and practices liberal democracy. So that's the first world. Now, the second world would be the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and their respective allies. And needless to say, this is the opposite of the first world. What they support is socialism in terms of political economy. And you see them as, again, adversarial to the first world, right? Now, in this taxonomy, what is the third world? Well, we still hear this term a lot, right? In fact, we may still use it, third world and even first world. It is outdated because these were terms that were created during the Cold War, and it is specifically connected to, as I've been describing, Cold War rivalry. But again, let me remind you that what's happening here is the collapse of European empires. I just mentioned the English and French Empire collapsing. But numerous empires, during these two world wars, 1 and 2, they collapse after being around for centuries for some of them. Okay, and what does that mean in terms of their overseas colonies strewn throughout the world? Well, those colonies or territories were now independent or gaining their independence. Okay, some of them were granted independence. Some of them had to fight against their former colonial master, right, for their independence. But nonetheless, these European empires were so weakened, so enervated by both world wars that they could no longer hang on to their colonies. Okay. Now, what I'm saying here is during the Cold War era, after World War II, what you see on a global level is massive decolonization. Okay. All these colonies throughout the world, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and what have you, are gaining their independence and establishing their own sovereign nations. Okay. And that is what the third world refers to. Okay. Again, it's specifically connected to global decolonization. All right. All right. So that is the taxonomization again of the world here. Now, this is what must be understood in this context, this geopolitical context and ideological context as well. Well, you have the first world against the second world, and much of their rivalry is in the form of trying to win the allegiance and support of the various decolonizing countries, that is to say the third world nations, to align their countries with either the first world or second world, because, it's up to them as they form independent and sovereign nations. Will they align with the first world and therefore adopt democracy and capitalism, or will they align themselves with the second world? Now, you have to think of the Bretton Woods Conference, right? Think of the supposed tendency of socialism to expand. Both the first world and second world they desire those countries to enter their respective orbit of the first or second world. Okay. So what was often done in terms of the United States approach was to convince these countries that were decolonized that, you know what, it's better to join the first world because the second world is, to use my earlier term, evil, right? It is not good. So what they're trying to do is win the hearts and minds of third world people. Okay. Now, from our perspective, sure, it is quote unquote evil, but socialism, if you recall, emphasizes equality. Okay. That's their, main attraction, is that it emphasizes equality. And due to many of these newly established third world countries having a history of colonial domination and control by some external empire, well, the message of socialism really resonated with these countries, with many of them. Okay, it was in some cases more attractive than ideas of democracy and capitalism. And the United States was fully aware of this. Okay, so therefore, much of this war was to win the hearts and minds of third world people. Now, it even got to the point where you see conflict. Okay, if the Cold War was cold between the United States and the USSR, it was, quote, hot, meaning there's actual military conflict in the third world through proxy wars. So what is a proxy war during the Cold War? Well, it refers to a conflict in which the United States and the Soviet Union, the two main superpowers, the first world and the second world, what they did is supported opposing sides, but did not directly fight each other, as I just mentioned, right? Instead, they used other countries or factions throughout the world as proxies or substitutes or stand-ins to advance their political or ideological goals, like spreading capitalism and democracy or communism. Okay, so proxy war is a conflict between factions in a third world nation, within a third world nation, that each side are backed by the Soviet Union or the United States. Think of the Vietnam War, right? That's a perfect example of a proxy war.